Mark sat on the edge of their neatly made bed, the morning sun streaming through the curtains, painting the room in hues of gold. He held a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, savoring the quiet moment before the rush of the day. His gaze drifted to the framed photo on the dresser, a picture from their anniversary trip to Italy, where he and Julia stood arm in arm, laughing against the backdrop of a sunlit vineyard. It was his favorite memory of them, a testament to the life they had built together. Mark often thought of himself as a lucky man. Julia was everything he had ever hoped for in a partner, intelligent, driven, and endlessly charismatic. Her recent promotion to vice president at her company was the latest milestone in her remarkable career. The celebration had been grand, with champagne toasts and heartfelt speeches from her colleagues. Mark had stood by her side, pride swelling in his chest, as she thanked him for his unwavering support during her acceptance speech. Their life was a picture of harmony. Mark, a freelance graphic designer, worked from home, allowing him the flexibility to take care of their cozy suburban house. Julia's corporate commitments often meant late nights and early mornings, but Mark never complained. He admired her ambition and did everything he could to make her demanding schedule easier, preparing dinner when she worked late, planning their weekends around her availability, and even surprising her with small gestures like flowers on her desk. Julia's new role, however, came with its challenges. The long hours, frequent out-of-town meetings, and constant phone calls had become a part of their routine. Mark noticed the growing stack of work folders on her desk and the exhaustion in her eyes after back-to-back calls. "I don't know how you do it," he told her one evening as they sat together in their living room. "You're amazing." Julia smiled, leaning over to kiss him. "I couldn't do it without you," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude. To anyone looking in, their marriage was flawless. Friends often joked about how they were the perfect couple, and Mark felt a deep sense of satisfaction in living up to that image. He trusted Julia implicitly and took pride in her achievements. When her phone buzzed late at night or she rushed off to a meeting, he thought nothing of it. She was building a career she had worked tirelessly for, and he was proud to support her. Yet, in the quiet moments when Julia wasn't around, Mark sometimes felt a twinge of unease he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't doubt he knew she loved him, but rather a faint sense that something was shifting between them. He dismissed it as paranoia, a fleeting worry that came from missing her during her long hours at work. After all, their relationship had weathered challenges before. What was a little time apart compared to the years of happiness they had shared? Mark couldn't have known that the perfect facade he cherished was beginning to crack, and the truth beneath it would soon change everything. The days began to stretch longer, and the warmth that once defined Mark and Julia's home seemed to grow colder. Mark couldn't pinpoint when things started to feel different, but it was undeniable Julia was changing. She became increasingly distracted, her attention often fixated on her phone or the glowing screen of her laptop. Their conversations, once filled with shared dreams and laughter, became short and fragmented, her responses clipped and vague. "Busy day?" Mark asked one evening as Julia returned home, her blazer slung over her arm and her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She glanced up briefly, offering a faint smile. "Always," she replied before disappearing into their bedroom to take yet another call. Mark lingered in the hallway, hearing muffled laughter through the closed door. He told himself it was probably work. Julia's job demanded a certain level of networking, and she often handled business calls even after hours. Still, the laughter struck a chord in him, feeling strangely misplaced. It wasn't just the calls. Julia's once predictable habits had shifted. She started coming home later than usual, often citing impromptu meetings or extended client dinners. "I'll be back by 9, she'd text, only to arrive close to midnight with a hurried apology. When Mark tried to ask about her day, her answers were vague. "Just the usual," she'd say, brushing off his questions with a kiss on the cheek before retreating to bed. One afternoon, as Mark tied up the living room, he found an unfamiliar receipt on the coffee table. It was for an expensive dinner at a high-end restaurant downtown. One he knew they hadn't visited together. His heart sank as he read the date. That was the same evening Julia had told him she was working late at the office. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a work dinner she forgot to mention, or maybe it wasn't hers at all. Yet, the nagging feeling in his chest refused to dissipate. Mark decided to let it go, choosing not to confront Julia right away. Instead, he began paying closer attention to the little things. He noticed how her phone never left her side, even during meals, and how she angled the screen away from him whenever a notification popped up. When he'd casually ask about her plans for the day, Her answers felt rehearsed, as if she were reading from a script. One evening, Mark walked into the kitchen just as Julia ended a call. She jumped slightly, her phone slipping from her hand onto the counter. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Julia nodded quickly, a nervous smile tugging at her lips. "Of course. Just work stuff," she said, slipping the phone into her pocket. Mark's stomach churned. Her smile, once so comforting, now felt like a mask. The breaking point came late one Friday night. Julia had told Mark she'd be working late again, but something about her tone had seemed off. Restless, Mark decided to call her around 10 p.m. just to check in. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again, only to be met with the same result. Unable to shake his unease, he went to their bedroom to find her work bag, hoping to confirm her story through a forgotten meeting note or calendar entry. As he rummaged through her things, guilt gnawed at him, but he couldn't stop himself. That's when he found a small jewelry box tucked beneath some papers. Inside was a sleek silver bracelet engraved with initials that weren't his. His hands trembled as he placed it back in the bag, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was it for? Or worse, who was it from? Later that night, Julia returned home with a practiced smile. "Sorry I'm so late," she said, brushing past him with barely a glance. Mark didn't respond, his eyes fixed on her as she slipped off her heels and headed to the bathroom. He wanted to confront her right then, to demand answers, but fear held him back. Instead, he sat in silence, the weight of suspicion heavy on his chest. The final straw came the next morning, when Mark overheard Julia on a phone call. She was in their backyard, speaking in hushed tones. "No, he doesn't suspect anything," she said, her voice low but sharp. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He strained to hear more, but Julia ended the call abruptly and came back inside, her expression guarded. Mark's world tilted. The woman he had trusted completely, the one he had built a life with, was hiding something big. As much as he wanted to deny it, the clues were piling up, pointing to a betrayal he could no longer ignore. Mark knew he needed to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The perfect facade of their marriage was crumbling, and he was determined to find out what lay beneath. The nights grew colder in the house that once felt like a sanctuary. Mark sat on the couch, nursing a glass of wine, his mind tangled a web of doubts and questions. Julia was out late again, claiming another work meeting. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, but it wasn't enough to drown out the growing unease in his chest. He had always trusted Julia completely and without hesitation. But now, that trust felt like a fragile shell, cracked and ready to shatter. Mark replayed the events of the past weeks in his head. The late nights, the guarded phone calls, the expensive dinner receipt. Were these pieces of a puzzle? Or was he imagining things? He wanted to believe the best about Julia. After all, she had always been ambitious, driven and dedicated to her career. Her recent promotion had come with added responsibilities, longer hours, and more client interactions. Wasn't this just the natural progression of her work life? But the memory of the jewelry box lingered like a shadow. He had avoided asking her about it, afraid of what her answer might reveal. Mark took a sip of wine, trying to silence the doubts gnawing at him. Was he being paranoid? Or was his gut trying to tell him something he didn't want to hear? The following evening, Mark met his longtime friend, Alex, for drinks. Alex was the kind of friend who could cut through the noise and offer clear-headed advice. As they sat at a corner table in their favorite bar, Mark hesitated before speaking. "Do you think it's possible for someone to change completely? Like without you noticing?" Mark asked, staring into his glass. Alex raised an eyebrow. "Are we talking about Julia?" Mark nodded, his throat tight. "I don't know, man. Something feels off. She's been distant, secretive. I found this receipt for a fancy dinner, but she never mentioned it. And there's this jewelry box. It's not for me." Alex leaned back, his expression serious. "Look, I'm not saying jump to conclusions, but if your gut's telling you something's wrong, don't ignore it. You know Julia better than anyone. If she's acting out of character, it's worth paying attention." "So what do I do?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Start observing. Keep your eyes open. If there's nothing to worry about, you'll know soon enough. But if there is, at least you'll be prepared," Alex said, his tone firm. Taking Alex's advice, Mark decided to keep a closer watch on Julia's behavior. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. A few days later, while tidying up the study, Mark noticed Julia's work laptop sitting on the desk, its screen illuminated. She must have left it on in her rush to leave for another meeting. He hesitated. Snooping wasn't his style, but the unanswered questions in his mind begged for clarity. Mark approached the laptop, his heart pounding. A chat window was open on the screen, and his eyes immediately caught the name Daniel. Daniel was Julia's boss, a charismatic and well-respected figure at her firm. Mark had met him briefly at a company event, finding him polite but unremarkable. Now, seeing their exchange on the screen, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. "Dinner was amazing last night. You always know the perfect spot," Daniel's message read. Julia's reply was below it. "Only the best for you. Can't wait for our next meeting." Mark's blood ran cold. The words were ambiguous, but their tone was unmistakably intimate. He scrolled up, finding more messages that blurred the lines between professional and personal. The mention of a shared cab ride, compliments on Julia's outfit, and a late-night exchange about how much they valued each other's support. Mark's hands trembled as he clicked through the messages. He noticed a notification pop up, a photo attachment from Daniel. With hesitation, Mark opened it. It was a picture of Julia and Daniel at what appeared to be a restaurant. Julia was laughing, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. The setting was intimate, the kind of atmosphere reserved for couples, not colleagues. The walls seemed to close in around Mark. His chest tightened, and his mind raced. He wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but the evidence was mounting. Julia had been lying to him, there was no denying it now. That evening, Julia returned home, greeting Mark with a kiss on the cheek, as if nothing was wrong. She moved about the kitchen, chatting casually about her day, but Mark barely heard her. He was too busy observing the way she avoided eye contact, the subtle pause when he asked about her evening plans, the way she clutched her phone like a lifeline. "Everything okay?" Julia asked, her voice tinged with concern as she noticed his silence. Mark forced a smile. "Yeah, just a long day." But inside, his thoughts were anything but calm. He debated confronting her right then and there, demanding an explanation for the messages in the photo. Yet something held him back. He needed more than circumstantial evidence. If Julia had betrayed him, he wanted the full truth. Mark decided to bide his time, gathering more information before taking action. He began noticing patterns in Julia's behavior, how she always left the room to take calls from work, how her explanations for late nights often seemed rehearsed. He started tracking her stories, noting inconsistencies and gaps. One evening, as Julia prepared to leave for another client dinner, Mark couldn't help but ask, "Do you ever get tired of all these late nights?" Julia paused, her expression unreadable. "It's part of the job," she said, offering a tight smile before slipping out the door. As Mark watched her drive away, he felt a mix of anger and sadness. He had loved Julia deeply, supported her ambitions, and believed in their partnership. But now, doubt had taken root, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Mark reached out to Alex again, sharing what he had found. "It's not definitive," Mark admitted, "but it's enough to make me question everything." Alex's voice was steady. "You deserve honesty, Mark. If she's hiding something, you need to confront it. But do it when you're ready, when you have all the facts." Mark nodded, resolving to uncover the truth. He couldn't live in the shadows of suspicion forever. Whether Julia was guilty or innocent, he needed answers. Only then could he decide what to do next. As he sat alone that night, the weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. The perfect facade of their marriage had cracked, and Mark knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came spilling out. Mark sat at his desk, staring at the calendar on his phone. Julia had mentioned another late-night meeting, this time with a client from out of town. Her explanation was casual, but Mark's doubts gnawed at him. Every excuse, every story, seemed to carry the faint scent of a lie. He couldn't let the ambiguity consume anymore. If Julia was betraying him, he needed to know the full truth. Mark began to pay closer attention to Julia's daily routines. He noted her departure times, the places she claimed to visit, and the hours she spent away from home. Using a small notebook, he started documenting details, cross-referencing them with her calendar and what little she shared about her work. A pattern began to emerge. Julia frequently mentioned client dinners, but the names of the clients varied, and her stories often contradicted each other. One evening, she mentioned dining at an upscale steakhouse, but when Mark casually asked about the menu later, she fumbled, unable to recall any specific dishes. It was a small slip, but it fueled his suspicions. One evening, after Julia left the house dressed sharply for another meeting, Mark decided to follow her. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove a safe distance behind her car. He felt a mixture of guilt and determination. Spying on his wife felt wrong, but the unanswered questions weighed heavier. Julia drove across town, past the usual office district, and pulled into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant. Mark parked a block away and waited, his heart pounding. Minutes later, he saw her step out of her car, her laughter carrying faintly across the lot as she greeted Daniel. Mark's chest tightened. The way Daniel touched her arm, the intimate proximity of their stance, it was too familiar for a professional relationship. The sight confirmed what he had feared, but didn't yet want to believe. Mark returned home that night, his mind racing. He needed more than a visual confirmation. He needed irrefutable evidence. He decided to discreetly check Julia's social media activity. While scrolling through her posts, he noticed a few photos from work events. Daniel appeared in several of them, often standing close to Julia, their smiles too broad and relaxed for mere colleagues. One photo caught his attention. Julia and Daniel seated side by side at a table, champagne glasses in hand. The caption read, "Celebrating our latest project milestone." Julia hadn't mentioned this celebration, nor had she invited Mark. It wasn't definitive proof, but it deepened the pit in his stomach. The investigation began to take a toll on Mark. He felt trapped between two realities: the life he thought he had and the betrayal he was uncovering. Nights grew longer, and sleep became elusive as his mind churned with questions. Was there a way to salvage their marriage? Or was the damage irreparable? Mark found himself replaying moments from their relationship, searching for signs he might have missed. Had Julia always been this secretive? Or had something shifted only recently? The doubt seeped into every aspect of his life, leaving him irritable and withdrawn. Determined to confirm his suspicions, Mark followed Julia a second time. This time, she left the house on a Friday evening, claiming to have a team dinner at a downtown venue. Mark waited until she was out of sight before grabbing his keys and heading out. He trailed her car again, keeping a safe distance as she navigated through the city. To his surprise, she didn't head downtown, but instead drove to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. She parked outside a modest house, where Daniel's car was already in the driveway. Mark parked several houses down and watched as Julia knocked on the door. Daniel opened it, greeting her with a warm smile before pulling her into a hug. The door closed behind them, leaving Mark alone in the darkness of his car, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. Mark sat there for what felt like hours, his mind a storm of emotions. Hurt, anger, confusion, they all swirled together, leaving him numb. He imagined confronting Julia, demanding answers, but the thought of her lies, her inevitable denials or deflections, made his stomach churn. The memories of their life together felt tainted now. The laughter they'd shared, the vacations they'd taken, the promises they'd made, it all seemed like a cruel joke. He couldn't reconcile the Julia he knew with the woman he had just seen walking into another man's home. When Mark finally returned home, he decided it was time to take concrete steps. He began documenting everything he had observed: dates, times, locations. He saved screenshots of Julia's social media interactions with Daniel, and even photographed her car parked outside Daniel's house. Mark knew he needed evidence if he ever chose to confront her, or worse, if their relationship ended in legal proceedings. The thought of divorce terrified him, but the possibility loomed larger with each passing day. Despite everything, Mark felt conflicted. He still loved Julia, or at least the version of her he thought he knew. Part of him wanted to believe there was an explanation, however improbable. Could Daniel be a confidant rather than a lover? Could Mark be misinterpreting the signs? But deep down, he knew the truth. The intimacy between Julia and Daniel wasn't platonic. Her secretive behavior wasn't innocent. And the love they had shared was no longer the unbreakable bond he once believed it to be. Mark decided he needed to confront Julia, but not before he was fully prepared. He rehearsed what he would say, how he would approach the situation without letting anger cloud his judgment. He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted closure. As he sat alone in the quiet of their living room, Mark felt a sense of resolve. The facade of their perfect marriage had cracked, and it was time to face whatever lay beneath. Whether Julia confessed, denied, or deflected, Mark knew he had to stand firm. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about reclaiming his dignity and finding a way forward. The house was eerily quiet when Julia walked in, the the click of her heels echoing against the hardwood floor. Mark sat on the couch, a folder resting on the coffee table in front of him. He didn't look up as she entered, but his rigid posture and clenched fists spoke volumes. Julia paused in the doorway, sensing the tension in the air. "Hey," she said, her voice hesitant. "You're up late." Mark finally looked at her, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm but controlled. Julia's eyes flicked to the folder. "What's this about?" Mark gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit down." Julia hesitated before sinking into the chair. "What's going on, Mark? You're scaring me." Mark leaned forward, his fingers laced together. "I've been noticing things, Julia. Late nights, vague answers, too many meetings. I tried to brush it off, convince myself it was just my imagination, but it's not." He opened the folder, revealing photos, receipts, and printed messages. "Care to explain this?" Julia's eyes widened as she scanned the evidence. "You've been spying on me?" she asked, her voice tinged with indignation. Mark's jaw tightened. "Don't turn this around on me. I wouldn't have had to, if you hadn't been lying." "Who is Daniel to you, Julia? And don't tell me he's just your boss." Julia laughed nervously, shaking her head. "Mark, this is ridiculous. Yes, Daniel and I have been working closely together, but it's all professional. You're blowing this way out of proportion." Mark slammed a hand on the coffee table, causing Julia to flinch. "Don't lie to me, Julia. I followed you. I saw you at his house, hugging him like you've never hugged me. Professional? Do you take all your clients to quiet neighborhoods for private dinners?" Julia's face turned pale. "He invited me over to discuss a project. That's all. I didn't think it was a big deal." Mark's laugh was bitter. "You didn't think it was a big deal? Staying out late, sneaking around, hiding receipts. That's not nothing, Julia. That's betrayal." Julia looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "Okay," she said softly. "I admit I've been spending more time with Daniel than I should have. But it's not what you think. He's been supportive, someone I can vent to about work and other things." Mark leaned back, his arms crossed. "Other things? What other things, Julia?" Julia hesitated before meeting his gaze. "I've been stressed, Mark. Work has been overwhelming, and you've been distant. I needed someone to talk to." Mark's anger flared. "Distant? I've been here, supporting you, encouraging you every step of the way. Don't you dare use that as an excuse." Julia's tone grew defensive. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. I didn't plan for things to get this complicated. But maybe if you'd been more present, I wouldn't have had to rely on someone else." Mark's expression hardened. "So this is my fault now. You're the one sneaking around, lying to my face, and somehow I'm to blame." Julia threw her hands up. "I never said that. But you're not perfect either, Mark. You've been so focused on your own routine that you didn't even notice I was struggling." Mark shook his head, his voice trembling with frustration. "Struggling? You could have talked to me, Julia. Instead, you chose to turn to someone else." The room fell silent, the weight of their words hanging heavy in the air. Mark stared at Julia, searching for some sign of remorse, but all he saw was deflection and self-justification. "You know what hurts the most?" Mark said, his voice breaking. "It's not just the lies. It's the fact that you didn't trust me enough to be honest. We were supposed to be a team, Julia. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for what? A distraction." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mark. I just things spiraled out of control." Mark stood, pacing the room as he ran a hand through his hair. "Out of control. Out of control. Julia, this isn't just a mistake. This is a choice you made over and over again." Julia rose from her seat, reaching for him. "Mark, please. I love you. We can fix this. I'll cut ties with Daniel, I promise. Just give me another chance." Mark stepped back, avoiding her touch. "How am I supposed to believe that, Julia? How do I know you won't do it again?" "The trust is gone." Julia's tears spilled over. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn it back. Counseling, open phones, anything. Just don't give up on us." Mark stood still, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that they could rebuild what they'd lost. But the pain of her betrayal was too fresh, too deep. "I need time," he said finally, his voice weary. "Time to think, time to figure out if I can even look at you the same way again." Julia nodded, wiping her tears. "Take all the time you need. I'll prove to you that I'm serious about fixing this." Mark turned away, his heart heavy. As much as he wanted to believe her, he couldn't shake the image of her with Daniel, the lies, the deceit. Their marriage might not be over, but it was forever changed. Mark's mind was a whirlpool of confusion and fury. After the confrontation with Julia, he knew there was more to the situation than just her infidelity. The nagging feeling that something had been off for a while was now an undeniable truth. He couldn't just walk away from this without understanding the full scope of the betrayal, and that meant confronting Daniel. It wasn't just about Julia anymore. The more Mark thought about their marriage, the more he realized that Daniel had been more than just a passive participant in the affair. There were pattern strategies Julia might have used to get ahead in her corporate world, and Mark needed to confront Daniel, to force him to admit his role in this mess. The meeting with Daniel wasn't going to be easy. Mark knew Daniel's office building well, a sleek, modern structure that screamed success and ambition. As he stepped out of his car, his thoughts raced. Daniel was the kind of guy who had always carried an air of confidence, bordering on arrogance. Mark wasn't sure what to expect: apology, justification, or maybe even denial. But he had to hear it from the horse's mouth. When Mark entered the building's lobby, he was greeted by a cool receptionist who directed him to Daniel's office. After a brief wait, Mark was escorted into the conference room. Daniel sat behind his polished desk, his posture casual, but the moment he saw Mark's face, a slight unease flickered in his eyes. "Mark," Daniel said, rising to greet him with an outstretched hand. "This is a surprise. What brings you here?" Mark ignored the hand, his glare cold. "Cut the small talk, Daniel." "I know everything." Daniel's eyebrows shot up. I don't know what you mean. What are you talking about?" Mark's voice hardened. "I know about you and Julia. The affair, the late nights, the dinners, the manipulation. I want you to explain yourself." Daniel froze for a moment, the surprise on his face giving way to a quiet realization. He sighed, clearly weighing his options. "Look, Mark," he began, his tone more defensive than apologetic. "I'm not proud of what happened. But if you're going to throw around accusations, you need to know the full story." Mark clenched his fists, taking a step closer. "I'm listening." Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't start this, all right? Julia came to me. She was looking for someone to talk to, someone who understood the pressure she was under at work. I never intended for things to go the way they did, but I can't deny that I got pulled in. I let it happen, and I'm sorry for that." Mark's anger flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Julia came to you. You didn't stop it, though. You didn't say no." Daniel's eyes shifted uncomfortably. "I should have, but I didn't. She was very persuasive. I thought we were just talking, you know. She was going through a lot, and I was just trying to be a good colleague, a good friend. But over time, things got more complicated." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. "Complicated? How? Did you two just talk in her bedroom too?" Daniel's face flushed with guilt. "No, Mark. That's not what I mean. I'm not proud of what happened." "Okay. But I didn't seek her out, she came to me. And as much as I regret it, I'm not going to pretend it wasn't mutual. Julia wanted this." Mark's mind reeled at Daniel's words. He had suspected Julia's manipulation, but hearing it confirmed made him sick to his stomach. Still, he wasn't ready to let Daniel off the hook. "So what exactly was her plan, Daniel? You really think this was just a harmless affair? There's more to it, right? Something more than just an escape from work stress." Daniel looked down at his hands, avoiding Mark's piercing gaze. "She was ambitious, Mark. Too ambitious, maybe. She wanted that promotion, and she knew how to play the game. I don't know all the details, but she made it clear that her success in the company depended on her relationship with me." Mark's stomach churned. "You're saying she used you to climb the corporate ladder?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, she did. And I was a fool to let it happen, but she was very careful about how she managed things. I wasn't the only one who thought she was just a talented, driven woman. She knew how to get what she wanted from everyone, including me." Mark's jaw tightened. "You mean she played everyone? You, me, the whole damn office? How far did she go with this? How much was she willing to sacrifice for that promotion?" Mark didn't want to know the full extent of Julia's manipulation, but he needed to hear it. He needed to understand what he had been a part of all these years, what had been hiding behind her polished corporate image and sweet demeanor. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't realize what she was doing until it was too late. But Mark, there's more. I overheard some conversations, saw a few things that don't sit right with me now. Julia, she was using our connection to make herself look indispensable to the higher-ups. She'd drop hints, play the poor, hard-working woman. And I thought it was just her being genuine. Mark's blood ran cold. So she used you to manipulate the office into believing she was the perfect candidate for the job. And you, yeah, Daniel interrupted, regret seeping through his voice. I'm not proud of it, Mark, but she wanted that promotion more than anything. And she played me like a damn fiddle. The late-night meetings, the dinners, the moments alone, those weren't accidents. She used those opportunities to secure her future. Mark stood up abruptly, his anger threatening to spill over. So you're telling me that the affair wasn't just an affair? It was part of some calculated plan to make sure she got what she wanted. Daniel's face was pale. Yes, Mark. And I'm sorry. I never saw it coming, but I've realized the truth now. She used me, she used you, and she used everyone else around her. Mark's mind raced, his heart thundering in his chest. Julia's betrayal wasn't just a personal wound. It was a strategic, manipulative play for power. Mark had been the fool who had trusted her, the one who had been blind to her intentions. Mark's hands clenched into fists, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His marriage, his trust in Julia, it had all been a lie. And the worst part was that she had orchestrated it all with such precision, using Daniel as a pawn in her game. He turned to face Daniel one last time. I don't care about your regrets, Daniel. This is between Julia and me now. You've been a part of this mess, but she's the one who needs to answer for it. Daniel nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I get it. I'll stay out of it, Mark. But you need to be prepared. Julia won't give up without a fight. Mark didn't respond. Instead, he walked out of the office, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. He had a new enemy to face now, the woman who had once promised to be his partner, but had instead used him for her own gain. And he would stop at nothing to ensure that the truth came out. The pieces were falling into place. The betrayal was no longer just about an affair. It was about Julia's ambition, her manipulation, and the lengths she was willing to go to achieve her goals. Mark wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time.